We've just been looking at the demonstrations on the streets of London there. What do you say to those protesters who, after all, might say, look, it was Western capital which got us into this mess. Why should they then be posing as the saviors of the world?
Well, first of all, of course, you know, I think obviously we have responsibility to a wider range of the electorate than just street protesters. But look, Canada, as you know, has not been, we've not had the bank failures and financial collapses we've seen elsewhere. We have a private sector banking system that has operated under a framework of good regulation, good regulation and activist regulation.
So who do you blame then, the British and the Americans?
Well, I don't know that I want to be pointing fingers of blame. Clearly there's a problem that emanated from the financial sector from a lack of financial regulation. I happen to believe, I'm a conservative, I happen to believe in the long term we will see long-term economic growth from the private sector, but it does have to be a well-regulated private sector with transparent rules. And that's part of what we're doing here. We're chairing, Canada and India have chaired the G20 task force on regulatory reform, and I think we have a good paper that'll get some pretty wide
Well, I want to ask you about that, because do you see a split developing with President Sarkozy clearly saying he's not satisfied with what's being proposed and threatening to walk out?
Well, I guess I would say, Adam, that based on the conversations I've had, I think there's more convergence than has been led on in the media. What we're proposing in terms of regulation is, first of all, good, solid systems of national regulation. Canada has shown that that can work. And then some kind of international peer review mechanism, so regulations can be assessed. We've subjected ourselves to international assessment of regulations. It's a useful
exercise. Not something the United States tends to do very often.
Has not tended to do. We hope they'll do in the future. I think it's a reasonable compromise. I don't think the Americans and some of the emerging markets will accept a global regulator. These are, after all, sovereign countries. So I think we've got a system that's workable and respects sovereignty.
But will that be good enough, therefore, for the French who clearly want one?
Well, that will have to be their decision. But I think this is the only realistic approach. I don't think the Americans and others are going to accept international regulation, nor is it necessary. As we said in the case of Canada, we've shown that if you have a rigorous activist system of national regulation, that can be very effective. What we do need is some international standards and peer review so that financial products that are traded globally have some degree of robustness to them.
Do we need more stimulus, more spending by governments to get the world out of this recession?
Well, Canada, as you know, has an aggressive stimulus policy. It's my strong view that stimulus alone will not solve this. Stimulus will help us sustain economic activity, help mitigate against some of the catastrophic drops of output and employment that we're seeing, but the underlying problem, the dysfunction of the financial sector, must be fixed, and that is the #1 job in terms of restarting global growth.
So you would argue, or you'd be one of those around the table saying it's not a question of looking back and saying, look what we have already done, we actually need to look to the future, what more we're going to do.
Well, I would like to see, frankly, I'd like to see everybody do the minimum amount the IMF had suggested. The most important thing with stimulus in our experience is actually getting it done quickly. What we did in our stimulus program, we did a number of things. We reduced some taxes, but the most important thing we did in the latest package was we accelerated existing capital expenditure plans. So we didn't have to come up with a whole bunch of new plans. We're already doing some things that are on the book, that are books that are shovel ready, so the construction, they can go into this construction season. If we do massive stimulus plans, but they don't get out the door for a year or 2 years, they're probably going to kick in when the recovery's coming. At that point, we'll have crowding out problems. So we want to get the stimulus done quickly, and that's probably, at this point, more important than making it bigger and bigger.
I mean, there is an irony, isn't there, that the consumer countries that want the stimulus are the ones that can't afford to do it, while the exporter countries that could afford to do it don't want to do it.
Well, this is one concern I do have. We all know there's an underlying global imbalance problem behind this recession. And, you know, we can't, American consumerism, the excesses of American consumerism did get us here.
And
if we rely, well, and in other countries, and if we rely on simply stimulating the consumer in those countries, then I don't think in the long term that'll do what we need. Now, in Canada, as you know, we actually have pretty strong government, pretty strong fiscal positions from which to do stimulus. We have the lowest debt GDP ratio in G7. Even though our stimulus is large, we'll still have the lowest debt GDP ratio by a very long margin. So we can afford to do that without some of the problems in the long-term financial position that you do have in America and Britain.
On NATO business, now that the United States has outlined its Afghanistan, Pakistan program, do you regret the fact that Canada is committed to withdrawing its fighting troops?
Well, first of all, let's remember that it was just last year that we achieved the extension of our Afghan mission in the Parliament of Canada for an additional close to 4 years to the end of 2011. That was a major achievement. Canada has had per capita by far the highest casualties in Afghanistan. We are in Kandahar, next to Helmand, probably the most difficult province in the country. Helmand would, I think, be second. So I think we continue to make an important contribution. What President Obama's plan has in it is actually very close in principle to ours. We're spending a lot of time, yes, we're still involved in combat, but training the Afghan forces so they can take more of their own security, and we're putting more resources into a civilian transformation, a future emphasis on development and governance. Our goal must be, if I can be really frank about this, our goal must be not the elimination of the insurgency, the containment of it, and creating an Afghan government that can be responsible for its day-to-day security. We cannot run Afghanistan in the long term. We must be able to turn that country over to the Afghanis.
I mean, do you feel, as appears to be the implication of the American plan, that it's really got to be, the tide's got to be turned this year, or it'll turn into a defeat effectively?
Well, it's been, we have been losing ground the last several years. You know, ultimately, whether it was right or wrong, the war in Iraq was a diversion from the original mission to Afghanistan. I think NATO has to be successful in this enterprise, and I do believe that the enhanced engagement, particularly by the Americans, is critical to turn this around.
Finally, a difficult question of diplomatic reasons, but you are in the position closest to observe what's going on in America.
Right.
Do you feel, from the point of view of the outside world, that Barack Obama and his administration represent something different and perhaps something more positive for the rest of the world?
Well, it's first of all, it's clear that President Obama campaigned on a message of hope and change, and it's clear that he's brought that aura into the White House, into international relations. He's promised a more multilateral, more consensual approach. Everything in our dealings with the American administration convinces me that that is, in fact, the approach he'll follow. I would just put this caveat on it, that, well, we all welcome a more consensual approach from the Americans. There is nothing that can replace American leadership. There's very little can be done without American leadership. So I would hope that the nations of Europe and the rest of the world, having asked for a more consensual approach from the Americans, and I think we'll see it, will also respond to it, and we'll act together to address difficult global problems like the recession with the global approach.
Prime Minister, we mustn't keep you from Buckingham Palace. Thank you very much.
Thanks
indeed.
for having me, Adam.